Good morning and welcome to our Spring 2021 Lecture and Masterclass Series. Today it is my great pleasure to welcome Bill McKibben, author, environmentalist, activist, and co-founder of 360.org, international campaign that works in 188 countries around the world. Mr. McKibben will be giving us a report from the front lines of the climate fight. I'm looking forward to this. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for letting me join you, and what a pleasure to be with you all. I'm assuming that it is as nice a day in Johnson and in Linden as it is in Ripton in Addison County. It feels like the spring, if not the summer, is here. The sap run here ended on Monday, which is always a little sad. But on the other hand, the Red Sox just won 3 games in a row, so we should be in a good mood, which makes it all the worse that you have to listen to me this morning on this beautiful day, because my job in the world, I'm afraid, is at some level just to bum people out. And I've been doing it a long time. I wrote the first book about climate change, a book called The End of Nature, back in 1989 when I was in my 20s. So that was a long time ago. And since then, things have proceeded pretty much according to what the scientists told us they would all those years ago. We knew 30 years ago the basic dimension of the climate problem. We knew that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we knew that the molecular structure of CO2 trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. And we didn't know precisely how fast and how fast it would happen and how hard it would pinch. And the story of the last 30 years is it's happened fast and it's pinched hard. So far, human beings have increased the temperature of our Earth about 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound like all that much. I mean, if it's, 60 degrees when you walk out of the house this morning and 62 when you walk back in, you probably won't be able to tell the difference. But magnified over the scale of the planet, it turns out that that heat is an awful lot. Let me give it to you in other units. The extra heat that's trapped in the atmosphere each day because of the molecular structure of that CO2 that we have poured into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuel, the extra heat that we trap each day is the heat equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic weapons. Once you think about it in that way, you begin to understand how it's possible that we've done the scale of damage already that we've done. So more than half of the sea ice in the summer Arctic is now melted. That's an extraordinary change in one of the 3 or 4 biggest physical features on our planet. Instead of a nice white mirror that reflects most of the sun's rays back out to space, we now have vast expanses of blue seawater that absorb all that incoming solar radiation and just ramp up the positive feedback effect, this whole vicious cycle. That huge amount of heat explains how the seas are now beginning steadily and increasingly to rise. It explains why it is that we're seeing such huge changes in hydrology, in the way that water moves around the planet. If you wanted one scientific fact to keep stuck in your mind to understand how the 21st century is going to work, you could do worse than the simple physical principle that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That means that in arid areas, think about California, say, or Arizona, or the West in general, you get more evaporation and hence more drought. And that means that you get these kind of insane firestorms that we now see across the West. They're like nothing people have ever seen before. I mean, last year, the governors of 3 of the Western states ordered their citizens to go inside and tape the windows shut so they wouldn't be breathing the particulates coming through the air from all that wildfire smoke. Once that water is evaporated up into the atmosphere, it's going to come down. Water molecule vapor doesn't stay very long in the atmosphere. And so in wet parts of the world, like our part of the world, we're seeing huge increases in gully washers and storms that drop more than 2 inches of rain in the course of a day, the kind of storms that don't do anybody any good. In Vermont, of course, this was most exemplified by Hurricane Irene in 2011, which set the Vermont record for rainfall. We saw in some places as much as 11 inches of rain, and we quickly saw what 11 inches of rain can do in a state with very, very steep valley walls and narrow valleys in between. We're only now sort of fully recovering from that kind of the damage that got done. But our experience was small compared to some places. Texas 2 years ago saw the largest rainstorm in the history of the country. There were places in Texas near Houston that saw from that storm 5 feet of rain. Not 1 foot like we saw in Vermont, but 5 feet. So just imagine a column of water 5 feet high. That's the kind of rainfall you can only get on a globally warmed planet, but it's the kind of thing that we're seeing more and more and more of all the time. Tennessee last week had the biggest rainfall that they've ever recorded, with massive flooding in lots of places. But of course, California and Tennessee and Vermont can deal with some of this because we have some money. It's not easy, but it's, it doesn't destroy us, at least the first few times around. Other places, not so much. And this takes me to sort of lesson 2 of climate change. Not only is it big, it's incredibly unfair. In fact, I think it's fair to say that a kind of iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the more harder you are and sooner you are hit by it. So think about, well, let's use a very contemporaneous example, something that's going on right now. You know that there's all kinds of people showing up on the southern border of the US, immigrants, refugees arriving, hoping to get into our country. And you know that that's a big political to-do. The question is, why are they coming? And increasingly, the answer is because their lives have been upended by climate change. So last year, we had the biggest hurricane season we've ever had, more tropical storms in the Atlantic than there have ever been before. In fact, we ran out of letters in the alphabet for hurricanes and ended up using the Greek alphabet by the autumn. And the last 2 storms of the year, Eta and Iota, crashed not into the continental US, they crashed into Central America. They both hit just about the same place in Nicaragua, about 10 miles apart from each other in Nicaragua. And they did most of their damage in the country of Honduras, and they did a ton of damage in Honduras. The best estimate is that the damage was equivalent to 40% of the country's GDP. Try to imagine that. The worst storm that we ever had in this country, Hurricane Katrina, did damage equivalent to about 1% of our GDP. So if you're in Honduras, you're out of luck. I mean, you can't farm because your farm's covered with a couple of feet of sand now. The roads and bridges that you might take your crops to market on are wiped out. You're starving. And so you're headed north to the border. And when you get to the border, what's your claim on coming across? I don't mean your legal claim in this case, because who knows how that's going to work out. I mean your moral claim. Your moral claim is that you did nothing to cause climate change. I mean, the average Honduran is a rounding error in these calculations. But the 4% of us who live in America have put more carbon into the atmosphere than any other nation on Earth. And we've done it for 100 and some years. An enormous amount of the climate crisis now crashing into poor people around the world is our responsibility. And the surge in migrants we're seeing right now is just the beginning of this change. The UN estimates that before the century is out, we could see 8 billion climate refugees, one human being in 7 or 8 on the move. That's would be impossible to deal with. And so we better figure out how to prevent it. Preventing it means slowing down the pace at which the temperature is increasing, and limiting it as much as we can. Because, and here's the scary thing, I told you that we'd increase the temperature of the planet roughly 1 degree Celsius. We're on a path now to increase it about, on sort of business as usual trajectory, about 3 degrees Celsius, maybe a little more by the end of the century. And if we let that happen, if the temperature goes up 3 degrees Celsius, 6 degrees, 6 degrees Fahrenheit, there's very few scientists who think that we'll be able to have civilizations like the ones we currently enjoy. It's just too much damage, too much increase in temperature. And so we have to figure out how to prevent that from happening. That's the deepest human task maybe that our species has ever faced, because it's the deepest existential risk we've ever faced. And let me further set the parameters by saying we have very little time in which to do it. This is a time-limited problem, and that's not something we're used to in our political life. Most political problems, you do a little bit on now, and you come back in a few years and do a little bit more. I mean, the minimum wage is too low, so you get it raised to $11, and then you come back in a few years and you fight for 15, and down the road for some more, and people battle back and forth and compromise and negotiate and meet somewhere in the middle, and that's how it works, okay? That's not how it works with climate change, because if we don't solve it soon, we never solve it. Once we melt the Arctic, there's no plan for freezing it back up, okay? So we have to work now. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, these are the world's climate scientists who have gathered together to analyze this problem for the last 30 years. They put out their last report in October of 2018. And what they said was that if the world wanted to meet the targets it set in the Paris Climate Accords to try and hold the temperature increase below 2 degrees, as close to 1.5 degrees Celsius as possible. But if we wanted to meet those, we would need a fundamental transformation of our energy systems by 2030. And they defined fundamental transformation as cutting emissions in half. So there's our deadline. There's our task and our deadline. We have now, 8.5 years to rejigger the world's energy system off fossil fuel. That's a very, very, very large task. It's on the bleeding edge of the technically possible to do. There are a couple of things that give us some advantage here. Thing number one, over the last decade, the engineers have done a remarkable job in dropping the price of solar power and wind power. It's dropped 90%. It's now the cheapest way to generate power across most of the world. And the cost of batteries to store that energy when the sun goes down is on the same kind of plummeting cost curve. That's all very, very good news. It means that if we wanted to change rapidly, we could, with an all-out effort of the kind that, at least in its beginnings, is envisioned in this new Joe Biden infrastructure plan, jobs plan, we could start making really fast progress. But that progress depends on overcoming not just inertia, which is always a factor, but on overcoming the vested interest, the power of the fossil fuel industry to block change. That's what's kept us from acting for 30 years. We now understand, thanks to great investigative reporting, that the fossil fuel industry knew everything there was to know about climate change. Way back in the 1980s, when I was writing that first book, their scientists were able to predict what the temperature was going to be in 2020, and they were spot on about it. And they were believed when these scientists told the executives at companies like Exxon. The executives started doing things like building all their drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. But what they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Instead, they invested billions of dollars in building this across the industry, this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that's kept us locked in a kind of paralysis for 30 years. They went and hired the guys who used to work for the tobacco industry and to make the same argument they've been making about cigarettes. Oh, we don't know enough. Oh, maybe it's not true, on and on and on, even though the science was abundantly clear. And that tactic worked. And as a result, we now have to squeeze 10 years work into 40 years work into 10 years. And that's going to be very, very, very bloody difficult. If we can do it, it's because not only of the work of the engineers over the last decade, but because of the work of people building movements over the last decade, which also makes a huge change. That's the work I've mostly been involved in. We started 350.org in Vermont, in the western side of Vermont, largely at Middlebury, with college students. And it grew into the first big global grassroots climate campaign. We've organized, as Tim said, I think something like 20,000 rallies in 188 countries around the world, every place but North Korea. And now lots and lots and lots of others have joined in this movement making. There's Sunrise Movement, which is young people around the country. There's Extinction Rebellion. There's the remarkable school strikes movement that started with Greta Thunberg in Sweden. And Greta is fantastic. I love working with her. But I think she'd be the first to say that the best part of it is there's like 10,000 Greta Thunbergs around the planet, and they have 10 million followers, and it's really powerful to see. What that amounts to is a kind of counterbalance to the political weight of the fossil fuel industry, an effort to try and match their enormous power to prevent change by having lots and lots of people pushing for change. And it's come in many forms. These are the groups and people that have done things like fight big pipelines. The first fight over the Keystone Pipeline a decade ago is now over. Joe Biden has said it won't be built, but there are similar fights raging right at the moment in Minnesota, where indigenous people are trying to block the Line 3 pipeline. In the Dakotas, where you remember the fight at Standing Rock over the Dakota Access Pipeline that's still underway. People have fought in other ways too. There's been this massive, massive divestment movement around the world to get institutions to sell their shares in fossil fuel industries out of their endowments. And some of the biggest, most important colleges and universities, for instance, in the world, Oxford, Cambridge, the University of California, the University of Michigan, the University of Vermont, have joined in this effort. It's to our shame in this state that the Vermont Pension Fund continues to be heavily invested in fossil fuel. And we can't get the treasurer to match, say, the work that's being done in New York to divest from fossil fuel. But that's a place where Vermont has real room to make change. That divestment effort's been very powerful and very strong. Shell Oil said in its annual report last year that it had become a material risk to its business, which is good because Shell's business really is a material risk to life on the planet. So, it's good that we're getting after them. Now this work is expanding into going after the banks and insurance companies and asset managers that are providing the money for the fossil fuel industry. So my last trip out before lockdown began was to DC, where I got arrested in the lobby of the Chase Bank branch nearest the Capitol, because Chase is the biggest single lender to the fossil fuel industry in the world. They've sent them $250 billion over the last 3 years. They didn't need Donald Trump to sabotage the Paris Climate Accords. They were happy to do it themselves. And so we're going to try and stop that and slow it down. And hopefully, all of this will add up to enough change happening at a rapid enough pace that we can begin to catch up with the physics of climate change. But we're not going to catch up all the way. There's a lot of damage been done already and more that will be done, even if we do everything right. So we also have to take care of the people who have been hit by this. And as I was alluding to before with refugees and migrants, it's going to be the biggest test of human solidarity that we've ever seen before. We need some new ways of thinking about all this. So let me talk for a minute about what people can do. The first reaction of a lot of people when they hear about climate change is to think, what can I change in my life that will help? And that's a good reaction, and I'm always glad for it. And I share it. My house is covered with solar panels and they're connected to an electric car, and I'm proud of that. But I don't try to fool myself that that's actually how we're going to do this. If we had a long time, 75 years, that would be fine. We'd be able to make that kind of slow cultural change that really is the easiest way for human beings to change. But we don't have that time. We have, as I said, 9 or 10 years to make huge shifts. And that means that you can't make the math work one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. So most of our effort has to be put elsewhere. The most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to make the kind of political and economic changes that allow for big shifts to happen. And the good news is there's lots of opportunities to do that. I mean, here in Vermont, there's the 350 Vermont chapter that does great work. And there's a Sunrise movement presence here in Vermont that does terrific work. And there's other opportunities for people to join in. But just make sure that it's at a scale that has real chance of helping. There's lots of exciting research and thinking going on. Some of it's about things like how we use agriculture, regenerative agriculture, to soak up carbon in the soils. That would help some. There's work about all kinds of new interesting technologies of the future that will get us somewhere. There's work on important things like buses and trains that make us more efficient, and retrofitting buildings, homes, so that poorer people aren't, because they lack insulation, having to heat the outdoors all winter long, and contributing not only to climate change, but to their own impoverishment. So there are loads and loads of interesting things we can be doing. But the key task, job number one, has to be closing down the fossil fuel industry as soon as is practically possible. Maybe as soon as is almost impractically possible, because we can't keep pouring carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It simply has to come to an end. Let me say that, and I'm trying to wrap up here so that we have time for questions. And if you have questions, start thinking of them. Let me say that this is a curious situation because we don't know for sure that we're going to win. Most times, I think activists and people in movements and things can be pretty sure that eventually they will prevail. Time is on their side. Dr. Martin Luther King used to say at the end of his speeches, he would say, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And what he meant, I think, was, this may take a while, but we're going to win. We're headed in the right direction. But the arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. And if we don't win soon, then we don't win. So we need people doing more than they're doing now. One way to say it is, The planet is way outside its comfort zone, so we need to be outside our comfort zones, whatever that means. And it'll mean different things for different people. You don't all need to go to jail, but some of you might. Um, um, and you'll find other ways to move this at the speed that it needs moving. And it's going to take everybody. Young people are in the lead right now. They're doing great work, but it's going to require older people too chipping in, um, um, backing that up, because we hold so much of the economic and political power in the planet. Those of us of the OK Boomer generation better start doing more than we're doing now, or else we're going to leave behind a planet far worse than the one that we were born onto. And that's a legacy no human generations have ever really struggled with before. So I can't promise you that we're going to win. And there are days when it feels dark with me. Yesterday, the monitor on the side of Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii, which is the place where we measure CO2 in the atmosphere, that monitor went past 420 parts per million. That for the first time. That means that we've increased by 50% the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's a huge landmark moment and a very dangerous and scary one. It's possible that we've waited too long to get started. It's possible that the denial strategy of the fossil fuel industry was enough to prevent us from acting. On the other hand, there are some good signs right now. We elected a new president, and I think overt climate denial got on the jet with Trump and went down to Florida and won't return. And Joe Biden is doing what he can, I think, at the moment to try and make real progress. His new green infrastructure bill is really important, and we have to figure out how to get it passed. And thank heaven, we have, Bernie Sanders as the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, who's completely committed around these questions of climate change and doing good work to push things through. But none of this will happen unless there is a lot of activism that pushes people in the right direction, that opens up political space, that makes it easier for those politicians that want to do the right thing to do the right thing. The only thing I really can promise you is that if you engage in this work, you won't be alone, that there are millions of people now around the world who are gathering in meetings like this every day to try and figure out how to, well, not to put a too fine a point on it, trying to figure out how to save the world. And many of them are coming from places that did nothing to cause the problem, the poorest parts of the planet and the ones, as I've said, that are most vulnerable. So it shouldn't be too much to ask the rest of us to do what we can, to figure out how to push these systems hard, to make change happen. And if you do, you'll be doing the most important thing you could be doing in the world right now. Not many people actually get to say that in the course of their lifetimes, but the people who are involved in this fight do. There's literally nothing more crucial that they could be spending their time on. So to those of you who are already engaged in this work, I just want to say thank you so much. And I want to say further that you have brothers and sisters in every corner of the planet, so you should feel their power and their solidarity. They have a sense of what y'all are up to, and just as you do what they're up to. And for the rest of people, I just want to say thank you in advance for the work you'll do going forward. It's necessary. Not fair, we shouldn't have to do this. The warning from scientists 30 years ago should be enough. But we do have to do it. And so I'm always deeply, deeply grateful for those who join in. So I've talked at you for half an hour, which is a long time to make someone listen to a talk on Zoom. But I'm happy to have you talk at me for a little while. Ask questions, critique, comment, abuse, whatever your idea is. I'm not exactly sure how we're going to handle this, Tim, but I'll leave it up to you to figure out what the right
format. Sure thing. Sure thing. We have one question to get started with. This is from the YouTube chat, and please do put your questions or comments in there so we can relay them. The first is, at what point or year do you think we will see the worst effects of climate change, and what would it most likely be?
It'll grow steadily as the century goes on. Even if we started doing everything right now, it would grow for a while. I think that we're on a place where the most powerful effects will be felt in the decades that'll be the prime of life for the people now in college. So 20 years, 15, 20 years down the road. And what it'll look like is just an endless sort of series of one disaster after another. And the repeat time between these disasters will get shorter and shorter and their extent larger. And our resources in dealing with them will begin to shrink. So, imagine a scenario where there's, the kind of Hurricane Irene, but coming much more often, to the point where Vermont strong begins to feel a little less strong, and it gets harder and harder to react. One way to think about it, if you're a young person, is that whatever career you're training for now, if we don't get this under control, your career is going to be emergency response at some point, because that's what the world's going to be about. So we desperately want to keep the planet from reaching that kind of survival mode place.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer. That is the only question I see at this point. We'll give another minute here, but thank you again for your time and your insight on this.
I've enjoyed it immensely, and I'm very glad to be able to answer all questions in advance. That's how it should work, I guess. But many, many thanks to people, and do reach out to organizers in this state, 350 VT, the Sunrise Movement, whatever. Find a place to plug in, because we really need you.
Thanks again for your time, and enjoy this beautiful day here in sunny Vermont.
Indeed, indeed. Take care, everybody.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.